Forced to work from home by your employer? Laid off or feeling depressed at home? Do you want to make money working from anywhere? We'll show you how to do it from your couch. It's time for another episode of the Work From Home Show. Coming to you from their homes in Austin, Texas and Tampa, Florida, here are your hosts, Adam and Naresh.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Work From Home Show. I'm Naresh, this with Adam Schrader. Shout out to all our homies, homeboys, homegirls, home trans, all the work from homers out there. Today we have Earl Swift on the show. He is a fellow of Virginia Humanities at the University of Virginia and New York Times bestselling author of The Big Roads, The Untold Story of the Engineers, Visionaries, and Trailblazers who created the American superhighways, as well as Chesapeake Requiem, A Year with the Watermen of Vanishing Tangier Island, and the new book, Across the Airless Wilds, The Lunar Rover and the Triumph of the Final Moon Landings. Earl Swift, welcome to the Work From Home Show.
Thank you for having me, guys.
Let's start the discussion by talking about your background, a little bit more about your journey. So tell us how you started writing and how you became a New York Times bestselling author.
Well, it's not like I had anything to do with the latter part of that, but I was encouraged to write by my teachers in high school, like I think everybody who makes a living at this is, and went into newspapering while in college. Worked at newspapers in St. Louis and Anchorage, Alaska, and then for almost 22 years in Norfolk, Virginia, at the Virginian Pilot, and really learned to write on the job, and could see in the early '90s, early to mid '90s, that odds were not good that I'd be able to stay in newspapering long enough to reach retirement age, and so I started transitioning to writing for magazines, and then in 2001 published my first book, and this is my eighth. I've just I left the newspaper for good and at the end of 2008, and I've been scrabbling together a living as best I can as an author since. The Chesapeake Requiem became a New York Times bestseller last year, and like I said, I had very little to do with it. I write every book with the notion that the work itself is its own reward. That I can. My job is to tell the story as well as I possibly can, and it's up to the fates to decide whether anyone actually reads it. And in the course of Chesapeake Requiem, a lot of people read it.
Now, some of the things that you write, well, most of the things you write about are, massive undertakings that happen. You'd like to tell the stories of the people who, weren't talked about a whole lot along the way. I look at some of the things that you're writing about, like the superhighways, the moon stuff, and think, man, if we tried to do that today, with as divisive as the country is, there's no way. Like, the idea of getting funding for a national highway system just is laughable in today's world. What was it about the people and the times then that led to the ability to do these huge things?
Well, I think there was a political will that's been hard to come by recently. And in the case of the highways, I mean, there was a desperate need for decent roads. We as much as we complain about traffic today, we forget that any tie-ups that we experience, getting on our commutes to and from work nowadays are kid stuff compared to the just titanic tie-ups that occurred back in the 30s. It was, we had an exploding number of cars in the United States. We were quickly becoming the most automotive people on the planet, and we had no roads on which to drive. It was a crisis, and there was great public demand for it. So, that really was the deciding factor in the highways. The moon, lunar campaign, the Apollo program, it had a much less concrete need driving it, but I think it had a similar level of public support, and to a degree that few things seem to have today.
Well, sticking to the topic of roads and highways, I trust that you've been following the latest infrastructure bill under the Biden administration. What can we expect there? Because I feel like every president we have, like one of the first major pieces of legislation that they try to pass is an infrastructure bill. What's going to make this one different?
You're talking to the wrong guy. I'm a journalist. I'm not a highway historian. That book is 10 years in the past now, and I can speak with authority on how we got the highways we have. I'm not the guy you want to talk to about the future. That's not me. Sorry. I'm, my expertise lasts as long as the ink takes to dry, generally speaking. I'm an expert in nothing, but I talk to all of the experts. So in the case of the Apollo book, the book about these last 3 Apollo missions, I've spoken to an awful lot of people who were involved in the program and gone through all of the paperwork. And for the moment, as we sit here today talking, I can claim to be somewhat of an authority on that. But don't ask me about the infrastructure bill, because your guess is as good as mine.
So you don't stay in touch or stay up to date. I mean, you get the inside scoop, and I guess you temporarily become an expert, but you just kind of move on to the next story.
Well, just like any journalist, yes, that's exactly what I do. I will stay in touch. Stay in touch with the people who helped me. Generally, you establish a relationship with the human beings involved. But in terms of maintaining an expertise, no, I'm on to a completely different topic, generally speaking.
When you were learning about the space exploration and all of that, kind of how does what happened then tie in with what we're seeing now in the private sector with like the race to Mars? What were your people telling you about the whole idea of going out and kind of maybe even setting up colonies in other planets? Like, you see it from big companies, but did you hear any kind of that same passion and desire coming out of the people you were talking to?
Oh, of course. Absolutely. This would not have been possible without vision and passion. I mean, this was an effort that dates back to 1952, to long before there was a NASA. And it begins with Wernher von Braun, as so many stories dealing with the space program do. And a series of magazine stories that he participated in putting together for Collier's magazine, a big news magazine of the day, well respected. And his piece of this series was a couple of stories that foresaw how we would actually go about landing on the moon. And he introduced the idea of a moon car in those stories, very different from the one we got. But that was just the beginning of a campaign that involved hundreds of people. I mean, if you look at Apollo, it involved 400,000 people working for the government and for private contractors, all of them essential to the success of what happened. And the sheer scale of these ventures, was a bit mind-boggling. The Saturn V was a terrifying piece of technology and really complex. Millions of parts to the thing, and getting it right, getting it to work exactly as it was designed to work, took a tremendous amount of dedication. So sure, I mean, the guys who are putting together today's private side space ventures would not be in the business they're in had it not been for the groundwork laid through a couple of generations at NASA and at the contractors that built the machines that NASA used.
Your books cover space, the lunar rover, highways. It looks like you spend a lot of time in Virginia. I'm guessing you're based in Virginia. Do you write from home? Are you just calling people and interviewing them, or are you traveling all around the country, finding stories and pursuing stories?
Well, both. The reporting phase of any project takes you on the road quite a bit, and I traveled all over the country for the Rover book, and the actual writing I do from home. The difference between a writer and a would-be writer, I think, is the ability to sit still for long stretches of time. That is the prime attribute I think you have to have, and so I wrote this during COVID. I mean, I would have been in lockdown regardless. I had a deadline to meet, and so I was chained to my computer for about 8 months of the lockdown.
Can you talk a little bit about your experience getting, because a lot of our listeners are, they're not, I would say maybe one or two of them might be, but most of them aren't New York Times bestsellers. So how did you go about, and they might be writing their first one, how did you go about finding somebody to publish your very first book?
Well, my very first book was about a canoe trip down the James River that I undertook. Spent 22 days canoeing 435 miles from the headwaters of the James near the West Virginia line, all through Virginia, to its mouth at Hampton Roads, which is the Chesapeake Bay. The James is the longest river contained within the boundaries of a single state, and it's the single feature of the topography that has witnessed more American history than any other. Most of the Civil War unfolded on its banks. A good piece of the Revolution did the same. All of the earliest colonization by Europeans of this country occurred on the banks of the James. So I did this trip as a series for the newspaper, for the Virginian Pilot of Norfolk. It ran live, so the series appeared as I was doing the canoeing. I'd canoe 25 to 30 miles every day, and then in camp at night would connect, often via acoustic coupler. This was in 1998 with the newspaper's computers, and file my stories that way. I had a photographer with me, a guy named Ian Martin, who was using a first generation digital camera, and he'd file his stories the same way. And the series was just a tremendous hit with readers of the Pilot. And a few months after it ran, the University of Virginia Press gave me a call and said, "Would you like to turn that into a book? We hear good things about it." And so I remade the trip by car 4 or 5 times, spent 14 and a half months turning the series into a book, fleshing it out, rewriting it completely. Really, it's a very different animal when I finished the book, and that became my first book, Journey on the James.
Do you make it a purpose every day nowadays to write every single day, or do you take some days off, or kind of what's your method there?
Well, when I'm actually writing a book, I write every day. I have a quota that I maintain. I try to write 1,200 words a day. Often I'll write more. On a few tough days, I'll write less, but 1,200 is a reasonable length. It gives me a sense that I've made knocked a hole in the job, and it's a very unromantic measure of writing progress, but it's a measure, and I think that's what you need, because a book, when you sit down to start a book, I mean, the notion of cranking out 100,000 good words is pretty daunting, and the key is to break it into its major components, the story into its major components, and those major pieces into smaller pieces, and those into smaller pieces still, and then tackle each one in succession. And it's like the old expression, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And so that's what I try to do.
Well, 1,200 words is pretty good. That's a day. You'll be able to knock out a book in 2 months. My goal when I was writing profusely was just 250 words a day. And that worked out pretty well. And I could take days off. So it's not like I wrote every day 250 words. It seems like you write 1,200 words every single day. I would take maybe 2-3 days off a week and make up for the 250 that I missed by writing, 750 words one day or 1,000 words one day. But that's you can get a lot done. You could easily publish, if you wanted to self-publish, you could publish 4 to 5 books a year if you were doing 1,200 words a day.
Well, they wouldn't be good words if you were trying to crack out a book every 2 months. I mean, I write 1,200 words a day, and then I spend the first 2 hours of the following day tearing apart what I wrote the day before. And, what seems brilliant prose at the end of one work day will rarely seem so brilliant when you look at it in the light of the morning, the following morning. It's it's a 2 steps forward, 1 step back sort of progression that you work at throughout the whole project. And so if you were to take a net gain per day, it's probably 600 to 900. And even so, it takes me basically a year to write a 100,000 word book. And that's, that's for a first draft. And on Across the Airless Wilds, I took that story through 6 drafts and was still making changes, after the book was typeset. So it's a continuously changing, continuously morphing body of work that you're producing. It's not producing 1,200 words one day and then you're done with it. On to the next 1,200. Sadly, that's not the way it is.
So you're talking about changing it all the way to the end there. How do you decide it's done then? Like, it seems like something that you could go on forever and never actually finish the book because you're continuously changing it. So what makes you decide, okay, this book is done?
Well, you have an editor who says, sorry, it's gone to the printer. If you didn't have deadlines to work with, or if I didn't have deadlines to work with and didn't have an editor, I'd never finish a book. I'd be tinkering with it, until the day I die. But at some point, someone has to yank it out of your tight grip and say, hey, this has to go into the world now. And thank goodness for that. I've always had great editors, and they've been very conscious of my perfectionist streak and very good at reining me in.
Earl Swift, fellow of Virginia Humanities at the University of Virginia. Check out his new book, Across the Airless Wilds, The Lunar Rover and the Triumph of the Final Moon Landings. His website is earlswift.com. That's EARL Swift.com, earlswift.com. Earl, thank you so much for joining us on the Work From Home Show. Any final thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners, or anything else you'd like to promote?
I guess I'd just like to note that what appears to be a story about a simple stripped-down aluminum go-kart that was strapped onto the lunar module on these final 3 missions was, in fact, a transformative piece of hardware that changed entirely the way we went about exploring the moon. And the focus of this book is just that, what happened when the astronauts took this thing, this seemingly gimmicky piece of gear, onto the moon's forbidding surface. And I think it's a good story.
Well, to all our listeners, you can certainly get that book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your local bookstores. It's selling very well, just like his previous books, The Big Roads and Chesapeake Requiem. Earl is a New York Times best-selling author. So once again, Earl Swift, thank you so much for joining us, and check us out at workfromhomeshow.com. Leave us a review on whatever podcasting platform you use. If you have any questions, email us hello@workfromhomeshow.com. And until next week, keep on working from home.